Okay, guys, we are back with our third and final day of the overview of the entire Bible. We're going to conclude today with the remainder of your packet, and we're going to go over a broad overview of the New Testament. This is way easier to understand than the Old Testament, and it makes a lot more sense. So let's go ahead and dive right in with point number 9. This is found on page 14. The New Testament consists of 27 books written by the early followers of Jesus Christ. 27 books. Point number 10. The 27 books of the New Testament are divided into 5 historical books, 21 epistles or letters, and 1 prophetical book. So your blanks there are 5, 21, and 1. At this time, I'm going to have you look up at the screen if you're not already, and we're going to kind of go over this chart in more detail that's found directly under point 10. You're going to kind of look at these historical books, and you can write this part in. It's not on your screen. If you want to write above historical books in the left-hand column, you can write 5. The middle column is the epistles. You can write 21 above that. And then the prophetical book, you can write 1 above that. So that's the different books that there are. We're going to talk briefly about these books. If you look, let's start back over at the left-hand column of the 5 historical books. You'll notice that there are 4 that are grouped together: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are collectively referred to as the Gospels. So you can write the Gospels out to the side. If you direct your attention to the middle column of this chart here, you'll see the epistles or letters. And you'll notice that those are also broken up into 2 groups. And we're going to talk all about this more in detail later, but if you just want to write that top group of letters there, or epistles, is known as the Pauline epistles. The Pauline epistles. And that means that they were written by the Apostle Paul. Underneath there, Hebrews through Jude, those are collectively known as the general epistles. The general epistles. And if you write that in there, it will really help make some sense when we go back through this chart and talk a little bit more about it. Okay, so if we look underneath this chart of the books of the New Testament, at the bottom of page 14 there, we'll see point number 11. And so we have a few things we need to fill in here. The Gospels present Jesus Christ from the unique perspective of 4 different authors, writing to 4 different audiences. And together, they paint a compelling, complementary, not contradictory picture of Jesus. The first 3 are considered synoptic gospels. Synoptic gospels. And that means, quote unquote, in this blank, seeing together. Seeing together. So going through that again, the Gospels present Jesus Christ from the unique perspective of 4 different authors, writing to 4 different audiences, and together they paint a compelling, complementary, and not contradictory, say that 10 times fast, picture of Jesus. These 3, the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those are called the Synoptic Gospels, and synoptic just means seeing together. So moving on, the Gospel of John, in your next blank, the Gospel of John is the last Gospel, and it agrees with the Synoptic Gospels, but was likely written to expound on the many teaching signs and miracles of Christ. So that last gospel is the Gospel of John, and it is not a synoptic gospel, but it was written most likely to expound on the many teaching signs and miracles of Christ. If you read the book of John, at the very end, it's kind of neat. It says there are way, way more things that happened, but there's just too many to put in this book. So I think John just kind of fills in those gaps and just gives us a little more insight to more stories that happened with Christ. He was the longest living disciple of Jesus, so he definitely had some time to do that. Okay, let's turn over to page 15, and there's nothing that you have to write here, so that's great. You can just kind of look at your page and listen along with me. We're just going to kind of go over these bulleted things right here represent the authors of the Gospels and who they were writing to, and just very, very brief background of each of these people. The first Gospel is the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew was Jewish, and he actually wrote to a Jewish audience. Matthew, when he was called to follow Christ, he was one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus Christ. when he was called to follow Christ, he was actually a tax collector named Levi. Tax collectors, just like today, were not everybody's favorite people. But Jesus chose interesting folks to work with him. And we all know, seeing through the story of the Bible that we've learned thus far, that God is going to use very ordinary people and turn them into awesome people to do his work. So that's a little bit about Matthew. The second gospel is the Gospel of Mark. His name was John Mark. Now, Mark is going to preach to the Roman audience. And he was not one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus. He was an attendant to the Apostle Peter, who was one of the original 12. So that's who he kind of learned from. And he also traveled with Paul and Barnabas. Those are two people, or Paul especially is someone that we're going to talk about a little bit more later. He traveled with them on their first missionary journey. An interesting thing about the Gospel of Mark is that it records more miracles than any other gospel, any of the other four Gospels. Okay, next we're going to talk about the Gospel of Luke. Luke was a Greek who wrote to the Greeks. And Luke was actually a Gentile. And Gentile means non-Jew. So he wasn't one of the chosen people of God. Most of the people that at this time were converts from Judaism to Christianity. But Luke was Greek. And so he actually was the only non-Jew or Gentile, which is another name for non-Jew, writer of the New Testament. He was a physician, and he was a very detailed and credible historian. He was not one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus, but he was a missionary companion and a student of the Apostle Paul. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk more about Paul. Paul was also not one of the original 12, but he was very, very important in the spread of the gospel, and we'll talk about him later. Luke also wrote one other book of the New Testament, and that was the book of Acts, and that immediately follows the Gospels. Okay. So the last author of the Gospels is John, the book of John. That's not to be confused with John the Baptist. It can be confusing. There's a lot of Johns. There's a lot of everybody in the Bible. The names repeat quite a bit. He was not the John the Baptist. And John, he actually wrote to the entire world. So his audience was everybody. Because, what we learned is that the gospel and Jesus Christ is meant to reach out to everyone. So John is not addressing anyone in particular. He's addressing the entire world. He was one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus, and he actually called himself the disciple that Jesus loved. He really liked himself, but he called himself the disciple that Jesus loved. He's the author of the gospel that's not the synoptic gospel like we just talked about. He talks about the journey of Christ somewhat differently than the others, but it all complements the previous gospels. He actually authors a few other books in the Bible. He's going to be the author of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And he's also going to be the author of the last book of the Bible of Revelation. Okay, so now you know a little bit about the Gospels, their authors, and who they were writing to. And we're going to move on now to point number 12. And some of this is probably going to reiterate what we talked about in the chart, but just bear with me. So on point number 12, we see the book of Acts, and that's the book that follows the Gospels. The book of Acts records the spread of the gospel to the city of Jerusalem. To the city of Jerusalem. And that story can be found in Acts chapters 1 through 7. The surrounding areas of Judea and Samaria. And that can be found in chapters 8 through 12. Judea and Samaria. And the quote-unquote remotest parts of the earth through the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. So your blanks there is... The book of Acts records the spread of the gospel to the city of Jerusalem, the surrounding areas of Judea and Samaria, and the remotest parts of the earth. Okay, so these next two numbers, numbers 13 and 14, they're going to go through that middle column that we saw in that chart earlier, the epistles. So number 13 is the Pauline epistles. The Pauline epistles were written by Paul, who was addressing specific new churches or people. These are the 13 books written between Acts and Hebrews. So these were the Pauline epistles on number 13. Number 14, we're talking about the general epistles, so the ones that Paul didn't write. The general epistles are so called because mainly they are not addressed to specific churches or individuals, but they might be better called the non-Pauline epistles. So in your blank there, non-Pauline epistles. These are the 8 letters that were written after the Pauline epistles and before Revelation. So it's easy to kind of think of them as the ones Paul wrote, and then the general ones, which are the ones that Paul didn't write. So we're going to kind of break here and go, okay, so who is Paul? I had heard of the Apostle Paul. I didn't know really anything about him because I didn't know anything about the Bible a couple years ago. But the story of Paul was another thing that really tugged at my heart when I became a Christian. So for those of you who know, bear with me, and for those of you who don't, listen up. Paul was not one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus Christ. He was actually then, at the time of Jesus dying and his ascension and the spread of Christianity, Paul was actually known as Saul of Tarsus. And Saul of Tarsus, he was a very bad man. He made it his mission to hunt down, kill, persecute, what have you, Christians. He was ready to stop the Christian faith. So he was not obviously a disciple of Jesus at all, but he actually did have an encounter with Jesus after Jesus' ascension. And so Paul is en route one day going to persecute a family, or a group of early Christians. And he's en route to Damascus, and he is on the road, and all of a sudden he's blinded, and it's, Jesus is going, why are you persecuting me, Paul? And Paul sees Jesus, and he basically, to make a long story short, Paul's soul is saved by this encounter, and Jesus saves Paul's soul, and he officially changes his name to Paul. So he goes from Saul of Tarsus to Paul, and he is going to be the all-time spreader of the gospel. He's going to be credited with writing like 50% of the New Testament. And so this story is really awesome because, sometimes we think we're too far gone for Jesus. We've done too many bad things. If Jesus Christ can take a guy who was going out and making it his life's mission to kill disciples and followers of Jesus, to turning him around, completely forgiving him, and say, now you're going to be the guy that is remembered throughout history for spreading the good news. It's a pretty cool story when you think about it. And so it just is one way that we can see God's mercy. Now, Paul is going to be extremely important to us because this is a discipleship ministry. And so if you look down here, you see the bullet underneath this at the bottom of page 15. Paul is important to us because he is our model for discipleship. Our model for discipleship. He carried God's word out with vigilance and invested time with a few individuals in particular, discipling them and multiplying the good news. So there's never a better example than Paul when you're wanting to know how to be a disciple. Of course, don't think about Paul and go, there's no way I can do all that, because he was amazing. But you can kind of look at some of the things and learn a lot from him about how he spread the message of God. Okay, guys, let's move on to our very, very last page. I told you today was going to be short. All right, so we're going to talk more about Paul's letters. These are the Pauline epistles we're going to talk about here in point number 15. Paul's letters are best understood in their historical context. A map of Paul's missionary journeys is likely located in the back of your Bible. I haven't seen a Bible yet that doesn't have a map of Paul's missionary journeys. And we're going to kind of talk about his journeys and imprisonments so that we can get an idea of these epistles or letters that he wrote to people. So the first bullet is, after Paul's first missionary journey, and that missionary journey is recorded in Acts 13 through 14, he wrote Galatians. And Barnabas accompanied him on this missionary journey. So that first blank is Galatians. During Paul's second missionary journey, so that second bullet down there, and that story is recorded in Acts 16 through 18, Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians on his second missionary journey. Silas accompanied him on that journey. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay. During Paul's third missionary journey, and that is found and recorded in the book of Acts chapter 19, Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans. So during his third missionary journey, he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians and the book of Romans. And on that journey, he didn't travel with anyone in particular. So he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans. Now we're going to kind of look at some of his imprisonments, and because he wrote from prison often. During his first imprisonment in Rome, he wrote Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. During his first imprisonment in Rome, he wrote Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. Okay, so the next point, after his release from prison, he wrote 1 Timothy and Titus. After his release from prison, he wrote 1 Timothy and Titus. And then finally, during his second and final imprisonment, he wrote 2 Timothy. So during his second and final imprisonment, he wrote the book of 2 Timothy. And like I said earlier, Paul comprises about 50% of the New Testament, his writings and teaching. These Pauline epistles were very important to the spread of the early church of Christians. So we can see that he played a big role, despite his shady past, to say the least. Okay, guys, we're going to move on to the very last point of this study. So bear with me through point number 16. We're going to talk about that final book of the Bible, Revelation, in very, very short detail. Okay, Revelation is the final book of the Bible that records the vision of Jesus, that John saw. Jesus' letters to the seven churches of John's day, and the things that will take place in the future. And we have chapter references here for that. Now, John is the author of this book, if you hadn't guessed or known already. So Revelation is the final book of the Bible that records the vision of Jesus that John saw, Jesus' letters to the seven churches of the day, and talks about things that are going to take place in the future. And our last bullet on page 16, this book belongs to a class of apocalyptic literature. In which the divine message is conveyed in visions and dreams. This book belongs to a class of apocalyptic literature, that's hard to say, in which the divine message is conveyed in visions and dreams. Major themes include the return of Christ, Christ as the critic of the churches, Christ as the controller of destiny, Christ as the conqueror of evil, Christ as the consummator of hope, and finally in its epilogue, an appeal and invitation to Christ. Okay, guys, you've made it through the entire overview of the entire Bible. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Don't feel overwhelmed. Remember to pray to God to help you to get through this and to give you patience. And honestly, for a lot of you, you probably need to pray to just have the willingness to actually want to learn this stuff. So I thank you so much for your time. Enjoy.